we tend to apologize or over explain or over justify. Oh, I'm so sorry. I can't meet at 3 tomorrow. I have like a really busy day. And boy, if I tried to squeeze it in, it would, but man, like maybe I could squeeze it in, but no, I can't meet at 3 tomorrow. How's 2 o'clock tomorrow afternoon? That is not rude. And the more we practice that, I kind of talk about like channel your mediocre white man at work. How would a mediocre white man say this? Would they apologize? Would they be wishy-washy? No. They'd be like, I can't meet at 3. How's 2 tomorrow? Do that.
Yes. Without a fuck in the world, right? This is Relatable, Relationships Unfiltered. Hey, welcome to Relatable, Relationships Unfiltered. Today I'm hanging out with Melissa Urban, co-founder and CEO of Whole30 and New York Times bestselling author. We're talking all about social media's favorite word, boundaries. So one of the probably most overused words on social media, yet probably the least actually understood, boundaries. What the hell are they? Like what, how do you even define them?
Doesn't it feel like boundaries have just like popped off in social media? If you're on the therapy side of TikTok, which I have been for a long time, it feels like boundaries are everywhere. And I do think that people are talking about them now more than ever, which is so good. It's so good. It's so helpful. But I also think that people still don't really have a good understanding of what they actually are. So I describe boundaries as limits that you set around how you allow other people to engage with you. So I think one of the biggest misconceptions about boundaries is that they're about telling other people what to do. And that's not at all true. Boundaries tell other people what I am willing to do to keep myself safe and healthy.
Yeah, and I think that's such a great point. I heard a distinction between boundaries and an ultimatum, and kind of described that way, that an ultimatum is really to control the other person's behavior or to control the other person as a whole. And boundaries are, like you're saying, about our circle of control, which is a huge term that I use in like all of my therapy sessions, circle of control. What do you think about that distinction? Does that feel true to you?
It's really interesting because I think an ultimatum, in the absence of setting boundaries ahead of time, can absolutely be about control. An ultimatum can be about telling other people what to do. If you don't quit smoking, then I'm not going to date you anymore. That's an ultimatum. The difference, though, or what I would add to it, is that sometimes the ultimatum is the final step in a boundary process.
Yeah.
And those are two different things. So if you are smoking and I don't enjoy the smell of smoke, I might say to you, please don't smoke around me. Please don't smoke inside my home. My boundary is that I don't allow smoking in my presence or in my home. If you continue to disrespect that boundary and I reinstate it and I'm clear and I say, if you can't respect this, we can't continue to hang out, then my ultimatum might be, if you can't respect my desire to not be around cigarette smoke, then we're not going to be able to spend time together. But it's very different to say that ultimatum as the last resort in attempting to preserve the relationship because you've tried to set a boundary, and in coming out of the gate with an ultimatum without even trying to have the conversation ahead of time.
Yeah, such an important distinction, because that ultimatum, boundaries without consequences are merely suggestions, as we know. And so when we're just suggesting to somebody, please don't talk about that topic, please stop asking me those questions, but we don't actually do anything about it. And I talk to my clients about that in terms of, you can gently state your boundary, especially if somebody doesn't know. Like, we don't have to come out the gate as an asshole. Like, you can gently state whatever that is. And if it's not respected, I suggest that we more assertively, state what that is. But at that third, maybe go around of it, it really becomes your responsibility to ask yourself, why are you continuing to engage? Because now you're just giving your power away in that situation. And so that's when I talk about, like, leave the conversation, leave the room, or sometimes it's about leaving the environment or the relationship.
Yes. So what you're addressing here is also another thing that people get confused about, which is, okay, well, where do a boundary and a request intersect?
Sure.
So the way you just said it is really good. I have this limit, and if you meet me in this limit, I'm going to feel safer. I'm going to feel better. Our relationship is going to be more open and more trusting, but you don't know I have this limit. You're not a mind reader. So I am going to express my limit the first time in the form of a request. It's going to be very clear, but also very kind. would you please call before you come over and give us an hour's notice? That's a request. Now, the boundary itself is if you come over without calling first after I've asked you not to do that, I'm not going to answer the door if it's not a good time for me. So
Mm.
the request can be the way we initially frame the boundary in the spirit of good communication and in the spirit of goodwill, assuming the other person just didn't realize we had a limit. But we always need to have the backup plan. What is the action that I am going to take if this person proves unwilling or unable to respect the limit? And that is my actual boundary.
Yeah, I love that. So you have written a book on boundaries. Um, Tell me what motivated that. Is that, should we assume boundaries have been a struggle for you personally? Is that something through your self-growth and your own development? Where did that motivation come from?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know anybody that hasn't struggled with boundaries.
Very
And
true.
while I would say I'm not a people pleaser by nature and never have been, I definitely struggled with boundaries when I was younger, especially through my addiction. And then, especially in my recovery from my drug addiction, I didn't have any boundaries. And when I learned to set and hold boundaries in my recovery and realized the power that boundaries had to expand my life beyond my wildest dreams, that was kind of the first like pin, right, in the
Mhm.
subject. And then in 2009, when I did my first Whole30 and founded the Whole30 program, which is a 30-day kind of dietary self experiment, I began leading people through the Whole30 and realized that you also have to set boundaries around food and drink when you're trying to change your habits. And people had a really hard time with it. So I began helping people set and hold boundaries around food and alcohol and diet talk and weight talk and calorie talk and around the food that they put on their plate through the Whole30.
Mhm.
And once people figured out I was really good at that, they started like sending me DMs. Okay, but what about my mother-in-law who's always dropping by without calling? Or what about the friend who's always emotionally dumping? Or what about the nosy neighbor who's like always peeking over our fence? How do I set a boundary in that area? And in the middle of the pandemic, when we all realized we had no boundaries and we were starting to become completely overrun, that's when the idea for the book came about.
That's beautiful. I love that. I could see how the Whole30 would lead to a lot of boundary conversations, especially with the controversy that comes out of it with a lot of different populations, and this how it's been, can be stigmatized, but almost from a place of like maybe a projection of their own insecurities, or
Mm,
because they don't get it, so they're going to tell you why it's wrong. I mean, I've done the Whole30 multiple times, so like I get it, I understand the value of it, I understand the benefits, but I also would receive the judgment. And
yes.
it's because people want you to eat with them, they want you to drink with them, and
Yes.
so I imagine that's where that came about.
You have to, you probably see as a therapist the fact that the people who you assume would be the most supportive when you try to make a change for your own health are often the ones who feel the most threatened and therefore give you the most pressure, give you the most pushback. It can be incredibly emotional. I'm sure you see that in your practice.
Absolutely. And I describe that as the solar system, because when you think about with ourselves and then our significant relationships, and we're like all rotating like a solar system. And when one of those planets comes out of alignment, gets out of the gravitational pull, it shakes everything up. And so everyone wants to just get it back to like, no, but on Friday nights we get drunk together, or on Saturday mornings we go to brunch, or, and that's really uncomfortable for them because it also shakes up their gravitational pull.
Yes, and they can feel like, well, what if we don't have enough in common anymore to sustain the relationship if you don't drink anymore? Or, what if watching you pass on the breadbasket makes me feel worse about my habits? And there's a lot of emotionality attached to it. So when you're in the position of wanting to make changes for your own health and you are facing that kind of pushback or peer pressure, you have two options. You either give in to keep the peace, which means you're compromising your own health and your own goals and your own integrity, or you learn how to set boundaries and say no and say, this is an action that I'm going to take for myself because it's in my highest good. And I'm going to learn to communicate with you that, like, this kind of peer pressure or this kind of behavior won't be tolerated. And here's what I'm going to do to make sure that I can uphold my goals.
Yeah, which is so hard. And especially the most common thing, I'm sure you hear it all the time, that people feel mean. They feel like they're being disrespectful, hurting people's feelings when they set their boundaries. And that is, I say it all the time, humans are designed for adaptation, so we can get used to this new behavior, but because it's not been a norm for us, and because people pleasing or violating our own boundaries has been a part of what we've perceived as survival, in the sense of that's how we're accepted, that's how we get people to like us, it feels really threatening when we decide to start saying no.
Yes. And women in particular, and especially moms, have been conditioned by the patriarchy and stereotypically rigid gender roles, and sometimes religious influence and diet culture and trauma to be small, to be compliant. We are taught to put everyone else's needs and feelings ahead of our own. And when we become moms, I'm praised the most as a mom when I am selfless. I have no self. I'm giving everything to my kid and my family. And then when I do have a need and I speak up, what happens? We're called bitchy. We're called demanding. We're told we have too many rules. And so this kind of like feedback loop teaches us that we shouldn't have needs, we shouldn't have feelings, and if we do, we absolutely should not express them, and like we shouldn't even be on our own list. So there's a lot of unlearning we have to do just to get to the point where we're like, no, 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 my needs matter, my feelings matter, they are valid, they are worthy, and then we have to learn how to express them and share them.
Which is definitely the hard part. Where do you start when you're helping people to do that? Do you have a formula that you use of step by step of helping them to adapt, or where do you start?
So the first step in my boundary practice is identifying the need for a boundary. So sometimes people come to me and they go, I don't even know where I could set a boundary. So here's what I want everyone to do. I want you to imagine a particular person. And when you think about this person, you immediately feel a sense of like dread, like, oh, I don't want to. It's the person who, like, when they text you, you turn your phone over and you're like, I'm not even going to bother. It's the coworker when they walk by your desk and you pretend to be doing something else so you don't have to talk. That sense of dread or anxiety or avoidance is often the first sign that a boundary is needed. So you can look for signs like that. If you don't like who you are when you're to show up as a version of yourself that they expect or demand. You can't show up as your full self. If you never know where you stand with somebody, if you feel like you're constantly being taken advantage of, those are signs that can help you identify the need for a specific boundary.
That's a great point. The nervous system, when it gets activated, we know that there's a reason for it. We know that we're in a threat state, and for us to stop and check in what's going on. I use the 3 W's often, and that's what's going on, where's it coming from, and what do I need? And the boundary being this third, what do I need? So what do I need? So this first part, the what's going on. So you're saying check in with your body, physiological responses, and then where do you take it from there?
So from there, you have to identify the specific boundary that you need. Very often, what can happen when people live in a boundary-less relationship is that they are just constantly, like, I call it eating it. You're just eating it. You're holding your tongue to keep the peace. You're going along to get along. You're always showing up the way the other person expects you to because you're trying to be nice or you're trying to be liked or accepted, and you're just swallowing it. And it is eating you up from the inside out. And then what happens is you get to the point where you're like, okay, I only have two choices now. I can show up exactly the way they keep expecting me to show up and let them run me over and feel awful about it, or I can cut them out of my life entirely. And it can feel like you don't have any in between. But the good news is that there are an infinite number of points in between where you can really dial in on, okay, I feel this sense of anxiety, I feel this sense of dread, but like, where is that coming from? What is that around? Maybe it's about a particular conversation topic where your relationship with your mom could feel so much more free and open if you knew she wouldn't bring up your weight. If
Mm.
that was the one conversation that you just didn't have, all of a sudden you're like a big sigh of relief. Everything feels better if I knew that was off the table. Maybe it's a specific behavior that you'd like them to stop doing. Maybe it's just something that you've been tolerating for a long time and feeling resentful about. And you just need to see something and kind of get it off your chest. And once you do, and they go, oh, okay, I didn't know you felt like that, you'll feel a lot better. But really dialing in on what boundary do I need in order to allow this relationship to feel safe and to expand it.
Do you see that people have a hard time identifying that? Or do you feel when they start to really reflect on their relationships, they're able to quickly see? And I'm just thinking a session this week where she was talking about the way that her boyfriend talks to her. And she's like, yeah, but I have thick skin, so it's fine. And as we continue the session, like, she's been really distressed since that conversation, so helping her to make that awareness. But then when I had a very similar conversation of where do you think we should, consider boundaries, or maybe what's for him not to say anymore. And for her, she really sat in that and was like, I wouldn't even know what to tell him not to say, or that I'm not comfortable with. Do you
Yeah.
see that with the people you work with?
I do, definitely. It can feel as though, again, if you've been accepting these behaviors for a really long time, it can feel like I don't even know where to start. Or some people are just so problematic in so many areas that it's like, if I talk to somebody about their mother-in-law and they're like, "Oh yeah, they come by without calling. They insert themselves into our relationship. They are constantly pitting my husband against me. They are commenting on my appearance. They're overparenting with my kids." Like there's just this laundry list of things that they need to address. So sometimes dialing in on the one thing that could feel the most relieving is helpful. Like, is there one behavior where if you just address this one behavior, most of the weight would be off and you could then focus on some of these smaller things? Sometimes it's where can you get a small win? So,
Yeah.
something like food and drink is a great place to start with holding a boundary or setting a boundary because you always have control over what you choose to eat or drink. So, if your mother in law or best friend, they're always really pushy about you having a glass of wine, that's where you can start by setting a boundary because A, you can always hold that because you will say, no, I do not want the wine. And if you need to, you'll leave the situation.
Yeah.
And B, that can give you this sense of self-confidence of like, oh, okay, I spoke that out loud. That feels valid. I feel like I deserve that. Where else could I speak things out loud in order to set the limits I need?
And where do you then help people to navigate? Because I'm sure that elicits a lot of fear, and their nervous systems probably get activated just from that conversation alone, right? Of telling somebody no. How do you help them to stabilize, to find some peace in that, to even find the confidence to be able to assert that when everything in their body is screaming like, don't you freaking dare?
Okay, you can tell me if you think this is valid or not, because I'm not a therapist, I'm not a somatic
Sure.
practitioner, but my advice is to practice out loud the things, the boundary script you are going to use before you say it. Because the more you say it, I believe that your body like internalizes that limit and it starts to feel more comfortable. It starts to feel more accepted. It starts to feel more natural. So I always say, tell your shower wall, no thanks, I'm not drinking right now. Tell your dog, please call before you come over and give us an hour's notice. Tell your, mirror when you're getting ready for work the next morning, oh, I'm perfectly happy with what's on my plate. We don't need to talk about it. The more you practice and say it over and over, the more I feel like the body absorbs this message that like this is true, this is valid, and then the more comfortable you'll be to pull it out in the actual circumstance.
And that is beautiful, and exactly what I suggest as well. The way the brain fires is the way that it wires.
Yeah.
That is the neurological impact that's going on when we practice something. And so I just talked with a client about that this week. We're doing assertiveness training with her, so very similar. Her to identify the boundaries, but then for her to be able to speak them. And she is just the sweetest, and so she often whispers her boundaries once we determine them, right? And so that's a big part of, go in front of the mirror. And we talk about like even practicing the diaphragmatic release when you're doing it, that you're really doing it from your gut. But we talked about the same thing, in the car on the way home, you have a 45-minute drive, repeat it,
Yes.
repeat it louder, firmer. So yeah, that is so true.
I
The
also
role play is
think
powerful.
the fact that you're doing role playing with her and you are sharing some semblance of a script is also really helpful because I also find that people do get nervous about setting boundaries. And what typically happens is it comes out sounding like this. So I just wanted to talk to you about something. It's not a big deal at all, but I'm wondering if maybe like the next time you come over, I wonder if maybe you could call first. And like if you don't want to, that like it ends up coming out this really squishy, wishy-washy, or you hint and you assume that they get the message, but they don't because it's not clear. Having a script can really help. And unlearning the idea, again, especially for women, that direct equals rude. We have been conditioned that when we speak directly without the conditions, without apologizing first for our very existence, that somehow it's rude. It's rude to say, oh, please don't comment on my plate. I'm perfectly happy with what's on it. Or no, I can't meet at 3. How about tomorrow? we tend to apologize or over explain or over justify. Oh, I'm so sorry. I can't meet at 3 tomorrow. I have like a really busy day. And boy, if I tried to squeeze it in, it would, but man, like maybe I could squeeze it in, but no, I can't meet at 3 tomorrow. How's 2 o'clock tomorrow afternoon? That is not rude. And the more we practice that, I kind of talk about like channel your mediocre white man at work. How would a mediocre white man say this? Would they apologize? Would they be wishy washy? No, they'd be like, I can't meet at 3. How's 2 tomorrow? Do that.
Yes. Without a fuck in the world, right? That's exactly right. And I love that. In the role playing, if there's somebody that you feel safe with, you feel comfortable with, and this is something you're trying to learn, I would suggest ask a friend to do it with you. And what we also practice is the friend giving pushback, because that is what inevitably is going to happen, which I'm sure is probably here in the next step of your program. Because we hear either it's completely ignored, it's defied, we're given reasons as to why our boundaries don't make sense. Where do you go with that?
Yeah, there's a whole chapter in the book about handling pushback because it does happen. What I will say is this: we often go into these conversations armed for battle.
Mm.
We assume that every boundary we're going to set is going to be met with so much pushback, animosity, just anger and frustration, and most of the time that doesn't happen at all. Most of the time people go, "Oh, I didn't know. Sure." And you're like, wow, could it really be that easy? So I always say, go into these conversations assuming the best. Assume that the other person just didn't know you had a limit and cares about you and wants to respect it and wants your relationship to be good. Because if you go into these conversations armed for battle, you may end up provoking the very reaction that you're afraid of because you show up more aggressively, more coldly, with a shorter tone, with a meaner tone because you're anticipating their pushback. And then all of a sudden it does come off as rude or it does come off as short. If you are met with pushback, there are a few really important points. So the first one is the other person does not have to understand or agree with your boundary in order to respect it.
Mm.
So if I say to you, like, hey, Elizabeth, can we chat tonight? I really need to download something. Like, I got to dump a little something. And you go, you know what, Melissa, I had a really hard day today and I don't have the capacity for it tonight. I don't need you to explain why. I don't even need to believe you. I just need, as your friend, to go, okay, I understand. Thanks for letting me know. I'll find someone else to talk to and I'll text you tomorrow and see how you are. So that's the first thing. You
Yeah.
don't have to over justify. You don't have to over explain. You don't have to make sure the other person buys in. Your limit is your limit. And then the second point is that you can acknowledge someone's disappointment without going back on your limit. So if your mom calls and says, hey, we want to come visit this weekend, and you say, oh, I'm sorry, this isn't a good weekend. Can we plan another time? And they say, you know, I just miss my grandbabies. And this is like, we were really hoping to see you. You can say, I hear you're disappointed. I totally get it. I'm sure they miss you too. Let's FaceTime this weekend and we'll plan another visit soon. So you can acknowledge their disappointment without taking that so personally as if to say, oh, they're disappointed. So now I have to rescind my limit.
Yeah, and with parenting, that's a huge one as well. That when people struggle to hold those boundaries with their kids because they melt down, or well, I don't want to deal with the tantrum, and that's a big validate. Even if your kid is mad that you said no, they're allowed to be mad, and you can validate their experience and still say no. And it's a really hard thing to do, but also in a romantic relationship, the same thing. That often with our partners, we want to please them, we want to make them happy, and so when we sense their disappointment, it becomes very easy to start becoming over flexible on that boundary. Whereas, as you're saying, we can completely validate, authentically validate what they're feeling, that disappointment is real, and I'm still not doing the thing you want me to do.
Yeah. You know, I have a relationship golden rule that applies to all relationships, but it's especially helpful in romantic relationships that says, say what you mean and trust your partner to do the same. And
Mm.
I will say that since my husband and I have cultivated this since the beginning of our relationship, it makes these boundary situations so much easier. So my husband will say, like, hey, can we snuggle on the couch tonight? I could really use some like connection. And I will say, my mental health like really sucks and I actually need an hour alone. So I can't give you that to you tonight, like not right now. And he will say, "Oh man, that's rough. I really am feeling like a little lonely. I could really like use a little something from you, but I totally get it. If you get an hour of alone time, can we reconnect then and see if that feels better?" Or I can say to him, "Oh, I hear you're needing connection. I'm really struggling to like be intimate tonight. I don't think I can do like sexy time tonight, but could we sit on the couch and snuggle? Would that help? Because that's something that I can do. And if that's like good for you, then we can compromise there. But we have these conversations where nobody's taking it personally. Nobody's going to bed angry. And we're ideally meeting somewhere in the middle. So both of our needs are met in a way that doesn't compromise either of our limits.
And a healthy boundary being firm but flexible.
Yeah.
And that's the such an important part of that is we have the rigid boundaries, which are our walls, we have the porous, which are not boundaries, and then the healthy, and that is that we can have a boundary and we can feel a certain way, we can have an opinion, we can have these expectations. We can also take into consideration the other person's experience as you're describing, especially in a romantic relationship, and we can compromise without a way that becomes violating to ourselves or cold to them. I think that's where a lot of romantic relationships struggle. In your own romantic relationship, do you find that there's specific areas that are more difficult for you than others when it comes to boundaries?
Yeah, we have always struggled with the amount of alone time that I require. I need more alone time than anyone I've ever met. And when my husband was going to move into this house with my son and I had to go back to therapy so that I could figure out how to live with somebody again and like share my space with somebody again. But we had a lot of conversations where I was like, my need for alone time has nothing to do with you. I'm not mad at you. I'm not annoyed by you. You're not doing anything wrong. It's just how I recharge. And if I can get these small kind of chunks of alone time, when I come back together with you, I feel more connected. I'm happier. I'm more open. I will let you know when I need that alone time. And I'm also going to work really hard to flex how much capacity I have to people
Mm.
so that over time, hopefully, I get stronger and stronger at spending more time around people and I need less time alone. And that's exactly what's happened.
And what about for him? Are there certain boundary areas for him that he
I don't know. I don't know what this says, but I think I have more boundaries than he does. But I think maybe I'm more in touch energetically with what my needs are. And I'm very specific about protecting them. But, he'll be the one to come to me and say, it's okay if you want to go hiking by yourself this weekend. I totally get it. I could really use a little bit of sort of one-on-one time with you. When would you like to make that happen? Like, when would that work? So, the other night we made a plan that we're going to have regular date nights in 2023 because we had a conversation and realized that his idea of quality time is different than mine. And
Oh,
his
sure.
quality time is like, I want to go out. I want to be dressed up. I want to do something new. I like want to do things with you. And my idea of quality time is like, if we're in the same house together for 2 or 3 hours, even if we're doing work in different offices, like that counts for me.
Yeah.
So I think just this idea of like having an open communication, even when it's uncomfortable, he's really good about saying, I need to talk to you about something. It probably won't be comfortable, but it would mean a lot to me if you can sit down and like engage in this conversation. And I'm like, okay, let's do it. And that's been super helpful for us.
And to have two people on the same page with when it comes to boundaries and communication, as we know, is a complete game changer. When you're working with people on this topic and they have a partner, maybe one of them, and I get asked this question all the time, so I'd love to hear someone else's perspective. And there's maybe different views on communication, there's different views on boundaries. Maybe one person is really heavy into self-improvement and self-development and the other person is not on board. Where do you kind of suggest people start with that, or to even navigate it? Because what I hear often, which I will validate, is yes, I know I have the option to leave the relationship, but I don't want to. And so where to go with that?
I know. I used the word therapy 66 times in the book because I think the place you go is therapy. There are a lot of relationship challenges that a simple boundary cannot fix. You know this. If
Of
you have a
course.
partner who is not willing to show up in equal partnership and you are doing all of the invisible labor, carrying all of the mental load, and they are unwilling or incapable or weaponizing their incompetence around childcare or household care, you can't make them do that. You can't set a boundary that says you will do your own laundry because that's controlling. You can't control that. You can't set a boundary that says I'm never going to clean my house again because your home cannot function if it is not clean. So in some situations, the boundary you set is the relationship as it currently stands is not working for me, and I'm going to go to therapy to help me figure out next steps. And then
Mm.
you get the personalized support that you need to help you figure out how to have the conversations, what your next steps could be, what interim steps could be, or help you figure out whether or not it is time to leave the relationship. But get the support that you need and deserve during that time frame, because the only person's behavior you can control is your own.
So important. And especially when you're trying to navigate that on your own, you get so in your head and it becomes such a mind fuck because you have all of your relational programming. And so all of these influences and messages from childhood that your parents have instilled in you about making other people happy and pleasing them and not setting boundaries. And then you also have your internal like pulling at you, like that intuition that's saying this is not right, this doesn't feel right. And that cognitive dissonance can be really hard.
It's a lot to unpack. It is a lot to unpack. And a lot of times it goes back to like the way, your childhood and what your parents modeled for you and what you learned growing up. But here's something that I believe, and you can tell me if you see these in your clients as well. I think it only takes one person to change a relationship's dynamic, in that sometimes you changing your behavior, the way you respond to certain situations, the way you communicate, forces the relationship as a whole to change. Maybe not in the way that you hope or want, but
Mm.
something's going to change if one person is taking those steps to improve themselves, to understand themselves better, to communicate differently. That can have an impact.
It's so true. And then once you make those steps, if that other person is still not getting on board, so you're like, okay, I've done my work, I've made my changes, I've done all the hard shit, like I'm in this, and the other person, even after all of that, is still not showing up in the way that you need them to, then that just gives you even more clarity on like how to move forward.
I think that it does, this is like a little off topic, but I think about relationships being in seasons. And sometimes you simply outgrow the season or the way the relationship began. You change, you become a different person. And if you've done all of this work on yourself to self improve and rediscover who you are and heal old wounds and show up differently and restore your sense of worth and value and touch base with yourself and figure out what you need and what you want, for me, very often that leads to a natural evolution of this relationship is no longer serving me. Because I find when people are in mismatched relationships like this, at least from my own experience, it's hard for the person who's operating at like this high energetic level to pull the other one up with them, but it's real easy for the person vibrating low to yank the other one down.
Yep. Yeah,
Yeah.
in so many areas of life. And I completely agree. What are some boundaries that you suggest around communication with romantic couples? So whether it's navigating through conflict, bringing up topics of intimacy, do you have like specific tools around boundaries in communication?
I definitely talk about creating rules of engagement around conflict. I think it's really important for partners to understand their conflict language. How do you typically behave when there's conflict? For example, my husband takes off. He's like, I can't handle this. I'm overwhelmed. I'm taking off. And I'm like, okay, we're going to talk about this. I know that that's what you do. And I know that you're not doing it to punish me or get back at me. I know that you really do need time away to sort of process. So you take off. That's cool. I will not be mad about that. The agreement that we have is that you come back within a reasonable period of time and we re-engage in the discussion. So you can't just take off and never talk about it again. You can't take off for 2 days and not tell me where you are. But I won't be mad if you do need some space. And then when you're ready, you come back and we talk about it. And he's like, cool, that works. We know each other's biggest buttons. We know the deepest, darkest fears. The one thing we could say that would decimate the person, that's off limits. 100%. No matter what, like we just don't go there. And if at any time one of us needs a break or feel ourselves getting flooded, we have this kind of code phrase where we are like, hey, remember we're a team. And that reminds us that it's us against the problem and not us against each other. And very often that's enough to shift us out of this conflict mode into like, all right, let's take a breath and figure out like how we can solve this together.
It's crucial that that happens because often it is of the problem that's actually the issue, or even more than it being an external problem, it could be it's your inner child, it's your traumas from childhood, it's your traumas from your past relationship, it's these really vulnerable things that are going on for you that get triggered in conflict or get triggered and then create the conflict. But then that conflict just exacerbates what's already been triggered. And what I've noticed with my clients in my personal experience, that the way that you react to a trigger is very likely to trigger the other person, right? And so then the way they react, and then it just is back and forth.
Yeah, think about that anxious avoidant partner combination, right?
Gosh.
He's anxious, I tend to be avoidant, or like I'm pretty secure now, but my past was avoidant, so I can revert back to that. So the more, he feels separated, the clingier he becomes, the more I want to push him away, and that can exacerbate that cycle. One of the things that we've also found incredibly important in our relationship is that we each take responsibility for our own feelings.
Mm.
So I will come to him and I will dump. I'll be like, I am in a shitty mental place. My mental health is terrible. I'm super stressed about work, XYZ. I will just like dump on him. And he's like, I'm listening. I got you. Like, I hear you. I hear this is hard. But then I say, so I'm going to call my therapist and book an appointment. I'm going to go for a walk right now because I know going for a walk makes me feel better. I'm going to start taking my cold showers again because like I haven't been doing them lately and I know that those help. And tonight I'm going to go to bed toddler early because maybe I just need a good night's sleep. So I am dumping where I'm sharing, I'm venting, and he is taking that, but I'm not expecting him to pick it up and carry it. And he knows that I'm going to take the responsibility I need to make myself feel better. And when we each do that, it now feels like we're an equal partnership rather than one person is just carrying the other one.
And the important part that you stated is that he validates you, though, in that he is
Yeah.
not just sitting there either dead quiet or he's not offering unsolicited advice. He's validating your experience and that what you're going through is hard.
Yeah.
And then he allows you to arrive at your solution.
Yes, he's really good about that. I am less good about that. I'm the one where like he'll come to me and he'll be like, "Oh, my day sucked today. Like I couldn't find my jujitsu pants and I couldn't go to jujitsu." And I'm like, "Well, I don't know where your pants are." And he's like, that's not what I want from you. Like I don't need you to fix it. I don't need you. Can't you just say like that sucks?" And I'm like, "Oh yeah, okay." So I have to remind myself very often to be like, just say that sucks. Just say that sucks. And then like if he wants help, he'll ask for it. So I think it's important to remind ourselves to do that too.
Yes. And I often see like the two ends of the spectrum. And somebody I've been dating for a while, he tends to just get quiet,
Mm.
but then I tend to overly fix. And so, like, if we had somewhere in the middle of this spectrum, like as you're describing, like, hey, we could probably just tell each other. And my therapist side just comes out, and I'm
Yeah.
like, okay, put it away, put it away. But I definitely those ends of the spectrum. And I think it ties into as well, like upbringing. So for him, he's likely to respond that way because if he didn't feel like his voice was heard or respected in childhood, he's just not going to have one. And for me, I was the fixer. I was taking care of every single family member, including my parents. And so when somebody brings something to me, I'm like, okay, so what do you need from me? What do you want from me? Like, how can I make it better? But for neither one of us, we're both like, okay,
Yeah.
that's not helpful. So
One
next.
of one of the things that I find is that when you get more comfortable setting and holding boundaries for yourself, the more you do that, the more you realize that boundaries are not mean, they're not selfish, they're not controlling, they are a limit that improves the relationship. Once you get more comfortable doing that, you then are more proactive about encouraging and respecting other people's boundaries too.
Mhm.
So he will start showing up for conversations now. I'll be like, "Babe, I had a shitty day." And he'll go, "Okay, cool. Do you want me to listen? Do you want me to validate or do you want me to like give you advice?" He'll ask up front now. And I'm like, "Okay, this is just a listening conversation." Or, "No, I actually really want your advice here." And he'll go, "Okay." And he'll get into that mode. So that can be really helpful too. Like tell people
Absolutely.
how they can support you because again, they're not mind readers and they want to support you.
And what would a boundary look like if you did so the example you gave where you did the dumping and then you were able to come up with your own solutions. But what if you were kind of waiting for him to caretake for you or for him to solve it? What might a boundary look like there? Because I mean, the way you described it was great of like, we take responsibility for our own emotions. So when somebody doesn't do that and they want you to take responsibility for it, how can we give that back to them?
I know that's like an emotional dump when somebody just like dumps all their problems on you and they might ask you for advice and you give them advice and then they don't take your advice and they come back with the same problems a week later. So, in that circumstance, you might interrupt and say, "Hey, we talked about this exact same thing last week. If you remember, you asked me what you thought and I said you should go talk to your boss and maybe talk to your coworker. Did you do either of those things?" And they go, "No, I didn't." And you can say, "Okay, why don't you go do that first?" Because I think those are the things that are going to help. And I don't think we need to rehash it until you actually take that action. So you can ask them, like, "Hey, this is
Mm.
back in your court now." One of the phrases that Lori Gottlieb has used that I love so much is, "I wish I could be your therapist, but I can only be your friend." And even you can say that as a therapist because you are
Absolutely.
a therapist, but you're not your friend's therapist. And I
Yeah.
think it can be, you know, you're sharing things with me and I can be supportive, but I can't fix it for you. And we've had this same conversation a number of times. And I feel like I don't know what else to do. I wish I could be your therapist, but I can only be your friend. And if you want help finding someone to talk to or an online support group, I can certainly help with that. But I think we've exhausted this subject. I don't think I have anything else to contribute here.
And it's so hard to do, but so important. And again, practice, practice, practice.
Yeah.
I want to ask a question. It's a bit off topic, but going back to you had talked about your husband moving in with you and your son. How did you navigate the boundaries around blending the family? And did your husband does he have children of his own?
No, he doesn't. No. So he came
Okay.
in, he didn't have a lot of experience with kids, but we blended our family very slowly. Like over the course of 2 years, he spent time with us. He spent time with us, he spent nights with us, but we really took it super duper slow. And he did not even talk about moving in until my son said to me one morning, like, "Why doesn't Brandon live with us?" And I'm like, "Oh, well, I guess he could, if we wanted to." So we didn't rush anything, we didn't force anything. It was very much on like a chill timeline. My son needed to get used to him. Brandon didn't have a lot of experience with kids, so he had to learn like patience. And I would watch him talk to my 5-year-old as if he was an adult or be mad at my 5-year-old because he was like behaving illogically, and we had to have a lot of conversations where I was like, you're expecting him to behave like a grown up, but he's only 5 and he's not going to make a lot of sense. And like, here's kind of how you need to do it. My son was in play therapy at the time, so we had the benefit of a play therapist giving us advice about how to interact and how to merge the family. So we really took our time and did it right. And then once he did move in, I think we already pretty much understood how the family unit was going to operate because we had so long a lead in.
Did you put boundaries around his maybe discipline with your son, or the way that he could redirect, or like kind of that role that he could take?
One of the things we talked about, I wouldn't say I set a boundary around it, but I said, I watched my parents when I was growing up take these very cliche roles where my dad was the easy one and my mom was the hard ass.
Mm,
And I loved my dad and I hated my mom. And anytime my mom said no, I could go ask my dad and he would say yes. And I was like, we're not doing that because
mm.
that's bullshit. Like I love my dad, but I now see how unfair that was to my mom. And I didn't want to do that. So I was like, here's the deal. When he's with you, what you say goes. And he doesn't need to ask me because I back you up. And if you and I disagree on something, we're going to have that disagreement privately. We're going to talk about what's best. And then we'll go present a united front with the kid. And he was like, great, that sounds good. He has definitely, occasionally, he would make decisions that I was like, I wouldn't have done that, but I wasn't there. It's not my job. It's also not my consequence. So he's
Right.
going to have to deal with the kid if he like gave him sugar too late or let him watch too much TV. And then we both kind of, just talk about how we want to parent together.
Which is such the flip side of the boundaries. And as we're wrapping up, I just want to talk about for a minute this flip side of, we've talked this whole time about setting boundaries and enforcing boundaries and the consequences and all of that. But there is a flip side of that, and that is us respecting other people's boundaries. And that is really navigating appropriate expectations of other people, and also coming to acceptance. I love what you're saying with him, that if you weren't there, that wasn't yours to control. So on the flip side of that, do you do much of does your book address that kind of the receiving and respecting of boundaries as well?
Absolutely. There's a whole chapter on that too. And again, I find that when you get better at setting and holding boundaries yourself, it does become more automatic and more graceful for you to receive other people's boundaries. You tend to see them, they're not selfish, they're not controlling. This is a limit that you maybe don't understand, but in the
Mhm.
moment you can respect it. And then after you've demonstrated respect, open a conversation about it. Hey, I noticed that, the last 2 times I've tried to talk to you, you've said that you are busy. I'm good with that. I totally understand. I love you. Is everything okay? Can I help with anything? Are you going through a difficult time? Is there anything you want to talk about? If not, we can just make trading funny TikToks our love language until you have more time. That's all good, right? So those kinds of conversations become a lot easier when you internalize the message for yourself that boundaries aren't mean, controlling, or selfish.
Yeah, which can, I mean, can be so hard to do. Like when we're trying to convince ourselves, okay, we can set them, but I really do think the other half of the work is convincing ourselves that we can also receive them, and that
Yes.
somebody telling us no doesn't mean they don't love us, and somebody telling us not right now doesn't mean we're not important. And having that awareness as well.
It's boundaries create a sense of safety in a relationship. If you say to me, "Hey, Melissa, do you want to go to lunch?" And I say, "Sure, but I don't really want to because I'm busy or whatever." And then I show up for lunch and I'm resentful and I'm short and I'm snippy. And you're like, "What's wrong?" She said yes. That's not kind. That's not good for our relationship. If you say, "Do you want to go to lunch?" And I say, "Nope, not this week. I sure don't." And you say, "Okay." A, that's the kind, clear communication that builds trust in our relationship. And B, the next time you say, "Do you want to go to lunch?" And I say, "Yes," you know I'm saying so authentically,
Mm.
without resentment. I mean it with my yes means more, my no means more. Boundaries create a sense of safety in a relationship.
I love that. We're going to leave it there. Such a powerful statement to end this with. Melissa, tell the listeners, where can they find your book? Where can they find you online, social media?
Yeah, the book is called The Book of Boundaries, and it's available everywhere books are sold. And I am at Melissa U on Instagram, Melissa underscore U on TikTok, and my website is melissau.com.
Very good. Well, Melissa, I really appreciate your time. And this is such an important topic. I appreciate the clarity that you provided around it. And just even, I think, people listening who have been wanting to set them, you provided such a good formula of how to do it. So I'm very grateful for you. Thank you.
Oh, thanks so much, Elizabeth. It was a great chat.
Thank you so much, Melissa, for hanging out with me today to talk all about the Book of Boundaries. And thank you all for hanging out on Relatable Relationships Unfiltered. Make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, sign up for our newsletter, and find me on Instagram at Dr. Elizabeth Fedrick.